I'm really happy to welcome Brooke Goldstein to the podcast. She's going to talk to us about what it feels like to be inside a bomb shelter in Israel. Now, Brooke Goldstein is a filmmaker, an attorney, an author. I would also call you, Brooke, a civil rights activist, and you made a terrific documentary, The Making of a Martyr, in which you kind of got inside the world of Islamic radicalism. You talked to people in Islamic Jihad, and now you're right on top of this big fight over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So welcome to the podcast. Let's start by talking about your experience and the fact that you're in Israel, your children are in a bomb shelter. You know, we hear a lot in the media about what's happening to the Palestinians. We hear a lot about tear-jerking stories, but we don't hear a whole lot from the Israeli side. In fact, we often hear about the Israeli dome that is magically protecting all the Israelis while the Palestinians are sort of nakedly vulnerable. Talk about your experience and your children's experience and what it feels like to have rockets coming at you.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so grateful to be on this podcast with you, I just want to say, because it is so rare to find people in the media, people with large followings, who really get what is going on and who are on the side of truth, who are on the side of peace. And so I appreciate this platform. It has been the most terrifying 6 days of my life. I have never been in a war before. This is all out war. You mentioned before, there are a lot of images coming from Gaza. The images are horrific and they are heartbreaking. And I'll tell you something, nobody here in Israel is celebrating that there is conflict. Nobody is celebrating that Israeli boys and girls are risking their lives on the front line and having to go in and eliminate the terrorist threat. And the IDF is doing everything it possibly can above and beyond what is even required by the laws of armed conflict to extinguish the Hamas threat. And they are entitled to do that. Except being here and knowing that we are protected by the IDF, it's still just incomprehensible. How is it that the Israelis have allowed Hamas, a terror proxy of the Iranian state, number one, to exist, to amass weapons, to receive hundreds of millions of dollars from Qatar, for example, and to build this arsenal that it's been building for many years now with the sole purpose of shooting at civilians like me and my children. It is terrifying. And even worse is to see how the mainstream media and US politicians are justifying this.
Talk about the shelters and what they're like. Can you describe them for us so we have a feeling of what it's like on the ground? What does it feel like to be in there? And what do you hear and what do you see?
So some houses do not have a bomb shelter. For a lot of people who live in Jerusalem, a lot of the buildings are old. They were not built with bomb shelters. They have to run out on the street as rockets are firing above them. They have, I think, between 45 and 65 seconds, depending on the rocket, to get to a shelter. The shelters are crowded. If you don't have a shelter, you have to go run inside of a stairwell, or you otherwise have to seek cover and pray. We are extremely fortunate that the house that we are renting does have a bomb shelter. It is in this house the size of a really small bedroom. Now it has 2.5 mattresses in it. We've put all of our kids' stuff in it to try and make it as welcoming as possible. I've charged the iPads, and we put the cartoons on loud volume because you can hear the blasts. The blasts are so loud that they shake the foundation of the building. You can feel it in the floor, and it's very scary. And the other thing I have to say is the sirens here are not that loud. So anytime you hear something that kind of sounds like a siren, and speeding motorcycles sound a lot like a siren, you have this trauma thing where you're like, okay, that's it. I have to run to the shelter. So the whole thing is bizarre. I caught my kids talking to each other the other day. I have a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 1-year-old. The 4-year-old and the 6-year-old were having a conversation outside about people shooting rockets at us. This is, something I never thought my kids would have to be traumatized by. And obviously I feel an enormous amount of guilt having brought them here, which in and itself is tragic that as a Jewish person in the 21st century, I have to feel guilty and I feel unsafe to bring my children to visit the Jewish state.
Now, there's an attempt to talk about the Israeli targeting of civilians. What you mentioned a little bit earlier is that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is not targeting civilians. They're targeting military targets. Now, admittedly, civilians sometimes do get harmed. That is obviously tragic. But the moral difference here is that Hamas is targeting civilians. Isn't that a critical moral difference, that for Hamas, civilians are the target? And by the way, not just Israeli civilians. It seems pretty clear that even on the Gaza side, Hamas wants civilians to be hit because then they have a sort of exhibit for the media. It's been remarkable descriptions of how Hamas will put its facilities near civilian areas in order to, you may say, maximize civilian casualties for public relations impact. It seems to us, I guess, unbelievably ruthless, almost hard to accept that anyone would do that. But isn't this part of doesn't this reveal the nature of terrorism and the nature of Hamas?
Yeah, this is obvious. It's openly advertised. The Hamas terrorists and the Islamic Jihad, they have no qualms and they actively use their own civilians, including children, as human shields. You mentioned I made a documentary film called The Making of a Martyr, where I explored the use of innocent Muslim children as suicide homicide bombers, as child soldiers, as human shields. The main character of that film, for example, was a 15-year-old physically handicapped boy that they had recruited, strapped a bomb on, and attempted to blow up. This is no different. These Islamist terrorist groups seek death. They seek the death of the Israeli civilians, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. It doesn't matter to them. These are indiscriminate attacks. And they seek the death of their own civilians to maximize casualties. And when the mainstream media reports that there were, for example, 200 casualties on the Gazan side, without mentioning whether or not they were terrorists, without mentioning whether or not they were killed by the over 400 Hamas rockets that have fallen short in Gaza, a Gazan family of 8, it was just released today, a Gazan family of 8 was killed by a Hamas terror rocket that fell short. So you have to ask yourself, those who claim to be pro-Palestinian, but can't even utter the word, stop the rockets, they can't utter the sentence, stop the rockets, they don't care about human life. And they are facilitating this type of Islamist suicidal tactics, and they're rewarding them by completely ignoring it.
Brooke, I want to ask you finally about what's happening in America, because one of the things that Rashida Tlaib was one of the kind of gang of 4. This is the kind of emerging wing of the Democratic Party that's very pro-Palestinian and so on, has sort of equated what's happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians on the one hand, between what's happening between blacks and whites in the United States. And the basic idea here is that the Israelis are the whites. They are the ones who have privilege. The Palestinians are the ones who are being occupied. They're the ones being terrorized. I guess the solution is for Jews to kind of acknowledge their privilege and sort of relinquish it. I want you to talk finally about what seems to me to be a preposterous equation, but explain from your point of view why it is so reckless, if not absurd, to equate Jewish-Palestine conflict to the black-white conflict in America.
So first of all, I'll just say this. No self-respecting Nazi would ever call a Jew white. The Jews have been persecuted for hundreds of years because we are the oldest, most persecuted minority community. We are a separate ethnicity, a cultural identity, a religious identity. And the whole attempt to paint the Jew as the oppressor, as the colonialist, is an attempt to rewrite history, when in fact the Middle East, and especially Israel and then Palestine after that, has been colonized by the British. It was colonized by the Ottoman Empire and many other such forces and states and so forth. And finally, the Jewish community, which is the indigenous community to the Middle East, is exercising their right to self-sovereignty. But I want to make one more point, okay? Many people often describe this as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I object to that. This is a conflict between Iran and Qatar and the West. This is a proxy war. And just a couple months ago, Iran released a statement saying they don't have to directly attack Israel. They use their proxies, they use Hamas and Islamic Jihad in an effort to pressure the United States. And what this is all about is testing the Biden administration to see if they are weak or not on terror, to exact concessions and create a movement with now this democratic so-called progressive left to be pro-Hamas and to be pro-Iran deal. This is what it's about. And a lot of those who are organizing pro-Palestinian rallies, for example, there's a group called Samidun, are connected and or work with and or support and promote terrorist groups, designated terrorist groups. So not only are they stirring up trouble, so to speak, in the Middle East, but now they're also doing the same thing on the streets of New York. They're doing it in Paris, they're doing it in London, and they're creating unrest and inciting Islamist crowds towards violence, not just against Jews, but also in the West, again, to exert pressure from the United States and our allies to be soft on terror. That is what is going on right now. And obviously, Jewish lives are being used as a political football in this war. And just one last thing, if I may, to say that the Jewish community is privileged is so naive, just shows a total ridiculous naivete when it comes to the history of my people. And despite the persecution and despite the history of genocide and occupation and colonization and discrimination that we face today, we still overcome. And it's because we are successful and have overcome this narrative and do not adopt the victimization narrative that we are again targeted for this.
That is a brilliant point, Brooke, and I want to thank you for all the work you're doing against the odds, because it seems like the media is tilted the other way, but you're pushing hard and others are, and I'm trying to do my part to get the other side of the story, to complete this narrative and let the American people, if not the people of the world, understand what's going on where you are. Thanks, Brooke, for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.